let's go ahead and get started. I am going to record today's session so we can send it back out in an email, and we'll have it in video form in the future as well, because I know everyone loves your content so much, Courtney, that I'll be happy to be able to refer back to it in the future. So thank you for joining us today on our virtual workshop for native plants for water conservation. My name is Christina Chikarovsky, and I am a water conservation coordinator with the City of Oklahoma City. And I'm so excited to have Courtney with us today. She is the Cleveland County Horticulture Educator, where she's been there since about August 2018. And she mostly works with homeowner inquiries, master gardeners, and other horticulture education programming throughout the state and the county. She's originally from Norman, Oklahoma, and she went on to study horticulture at OSU with an emphasis in entrepreneurship. After graduating from OSU, Courtney went ahead and moved to Raleigh, North Carolina to attend NC State for grad school, where she focused mostly on vegetable production, specifically processing tomatoes for a local salsa product, so I can't wait to give that a try sometime. And the emphasis on local products really is what motivated her to move back home to Oklahoma and work for the OSU Cooperative Extension. So we're really excited to partner today. This is the second time Courtney's done this workshop for us, and when we said we wanted to keep doing this workshop, we thought we would still be in the library, squeezed into a library room. We didn't foresee this being in a virtual capacity, but we're really excited to be here. Just a little bit of housekeeping information before I hand over the microphone to Courtney. If you are having any audio problems, put that in the chat. I'm going to put this information in the chat as well, because once this opening slide goes away, you won't have access to that information. If you have any questions or comments along the way, go ahead and drop them in the chat box. Hopefully you should have no problem entering that. Make sure that you're sending it to everyone. Make sure that you send that message to everyone so I can see it, and then we'll relay it back to Courtney as she's presenting as time allows. And the presentation is going to last about an hour, hour and a half. So get comfortable and get prepared to ask any of your questions about native plants for water conservation. Again, we're so glad you're here. And Courtney, take it away.
Thank you, Christina. I appreciate that introduction. I'm really excited to teach this webinar. I like working with you guys. It's a little bit different not being at the South OKC Library, but that's okay. And thanks to technology, we're here over in a webinar format. So today we will be talking about native plants and their role in our ecosystem, and the benefits of native plants and why you should consider some native plants for your landscape. And kind of specifically too within the role of water conservation and the ability to not have to put so many inputs into your landscape. So real quick, we are located in Cleveland County, so that's we're located in Norman, and we serve Norman, Moore, the lower part of Oklahoma City, Noble, and Lexington. And within our office, we also have an agriculture agent, a family consumer science agent, someone who can help you develop small business, and then also the 4-H and youth development program. So if you're not familiar with the OSU Extension Service, we offer a lot of different services, and we're always happy to help you, and we hope that you come by and come see us sometime. There are offices in all 77 counties of Oklahoma, so if you're joining us from somewhere else, check out your local extension office and then and see what services they have to offer for you as well. So today we are talking about native plants, and I like to start out with really defining what is a native plant. So, you know, we have to really kind of consider that boundaries are man-made. Plants don't give two hoots about the boundaries that we make for states or countries or anything like that. Plants are adapted to the environment that they are native to, and they tend to stay in that similar environment. And so for this, I like to consider pin oaks. Now, if you look at the map, which has the range of pin oaks, that would include Oklahoma. We have the northeastern part there adapted to that. But if you move to central Oklahoma, the pin oaks are not quite as adapted. They really do prefer low pH soils, so more acidic soils. And Cleveland County tends to be more alkaline. We have those higher pHs, and from what I've talked to my colleagues in surrounding counties, those counties are also higher. And we end up with these chlorotic, yellow, unhealthy-looking pin oaks when we plant them in our county. So while they are native to Oklahoma, they're really not native to our area of Oklahoma. So to define nativity and defining what a native plant is, I want to encourage you to really think about about our ecosystem and the relationships between the living and the abiotic, the non-living portions of our ecosystem. So our ecosystem consists of the plants and the animals that live here, but also the microorganisms, the beneficial fungi that live in the soil and live in that surrounding ecosystem. They all have relationships. They have been here and been evolving before man was here, and they have those existing relationships. But there are also the abiotic portions of that ecosystem, the non-living portions of that ecosystem, which would include the climatic conditions, so your temperature and the different sort of weather conditions that we have in that particular area, and then also the soil conditions. And so all of these work together to create an ecosystem, and they all have relationships with each other to be able to help each other survive within that ecosystem. It's kind of a living sort of system where they all support each other. And so if humans weren't here, we would have all native plants within our ecosystem, and that would really serve to the pollinators and the wildlife that's here. They're better adapted to the climatic conditions and the soil conditions. And we'll kind of dive into the more specifics of that here in a little bit. But really what it is that they're playing a role in our local ecosystems and really kind of playing that piece as opposed to maybe non-native plants. And so an example of that I have here is the passion flower vine, which has a beautiful striking flower. And it's a host plant for the Gulf fritillary butterfly. The Gulf fritillary butterfly is a butterfly and a pollinator that's native to our ecosystem here, and that plant life really supports the existence of that butterfly. So native plants are really kind of playing that role within our ecosystem. So there are several ecoregions in Oklahoma. Oklahoma is actually very unique and has a lot of diversity when it comes to ecoregions. If you think about all four corners of the state, if you were to go down all the way down to Idabel and then all the way up to the northeast or the northwest, they're very different from each other. And so that, what might work well in Cleveland County or Oklahoma County might not work well up in the northeast or up in the panhandle. And so it's very diverse, and kind of knowing what ecoregion we're in, we can really fine-tune the native plants that are available to us in our very local microclimate. So Cleveland County and kind of the rest of the central state, we really sort of sit on the cusp of the cross timbers and the Great Plains. And so we're able to kind of maybe use both of those plants, but also as you go, as you evaluate your property and your garden, consider that local microclimate and consider sort of what part of the state it looks like. You might be in an area that is very dry. Maybe you're up on top of a ridge or something like that, and you might have totally different plant requirements than what your neighbors 2 miles away might have. And so really kind of sort of consider your ecoregion and your local microclimate and what that kind of looks like in comparison to other parts of the state. That can really help you define what will do well in your yard. So we're going to focus on 3 benefits of native plants today. First is the providing shelter for pollinators and a food source. They also provide a food source and attract wildlife. and they are also better adapted to our climate and soil. And so these are three important reasons why I highly encourage you to consider native plants for your garden. And so first we'll talk about the shelter and food source for pollinators. And so I hope that this news is nothing new to you, but the monarch butterfly has been in decline over the past 10 years or so. This is a graph to represent the amount of hectares in Mexico where the monarch butterflies overwinter. And so they've kind of been tracking that to see and to sort of evaluate the populations based on the amount of hectares that those butterflies overwinter. And so I apologize, I did not update this graph for last winter, but I do believe the 1920 winter season was back in the 2.5 range, so continually going down. And the unique thing about monarch butterflies is that they're migratory. And so that graph was measuring the hectares where they overwinter in Mexico, but that's where they spend the winter time, and then they move in the spring up into the Midwest, and they'll spend their summers in the Midwest, and then in the fall, usually September, early of October, kind of around now, the monarch butterflies will move back down to Mexico. And so they're migratory, and they move back and forth between those two locations. Well, looking at the map, Oklahoma is smack dab in the middle, and we get to see those monarch butterflies in the fall and the spring as they're making their move to their next stop. So we're really kind of, a rest stop on the monarch migration highway. And, as Oklahomans, we kind of sort of have a responsibility to provide food and shelter for those monarchs as they move. So they might come down to rest in your garden. If you have a native garden with lots of food for them, then that gives them the energy to continue on their journey. And with monarchs, we usually, you can't talk about monarchs without talking about milkweed. So milkweed and monarchs, they have a symbiotic relationship. Milkweed has a toxin in it that is poisonous to many different plants or many different animals, and various other insects, but monarchs have developed an immunity to this toxin. So they are the only, the monarchs only feed on milkweed. And that kind of helps the milkweed sort of fend off everybody else, but the monarchs do eat it. And so monarchs will only lay their eggs on milkweed. That way, when their eggs hatch, they're able to have that food source readily available. And then after they lay their eggs, milkweed is the only plant that monarch larvae will eat. And so they won't eat any other kinds of plants. So if we're going to provide a rest stop and some energy for those monarchs on their journey, we have to have milkweed in our landscape. And so because monarchs and milkweed have this relationship, and Oklahoma is right in the middle of the monarch migration highway, there are actually 26 native types of milkweeds in Oklahoma. And so these are 5 of the most widespread native milkweeds in Oklahoma. I do believe those that are on the left, the butterfly milkweed, the green antelope horn milkweed, and the antelope horn or spider milkweed are starting to become very readily available in the nursery centers as people learn about monarchs and learn about their plight and want to help them as they migrate to their next location. And so, that's just one example of a pollinator and a native plant in that relationship that we can really help and becomes a great benefit when we focus on native plants in our garden. And too, that's just one pollinator. That there are many other pollinators that have evolved and have developed relationships with the native plants and the local plants to your ecosystem. And so really focusing on those native plants can help really protect those pollinators and give them a chance. Another example, too, of a benefit of native plants is providing food and food sources for wildlife. And so kind of an example on this one I want you to think about insects on our plants. We see insects and we think, oh no, they're eating our plants. If they're not a pollinator and we're not terribly concerned about them, we tend to think that they're all bad. But to us, maybe they're bad, but to a bird, that is food. And so those insects in the ecosystem that have developed those relationships and prefer those sources of food tend to go after those plants. And if you've got insects on your plants, then you're more likely to have birds in your landscape. And so talking about birds and other wildlife, birds need three things to survive: food, water, and shelter. And we can provide these things with our landscaping. So, if humans weren't here, there wouldn't be bird feeders. Bird feeders are really meant to be supplemental sources of food. Birds really do prefer to eat insects or fruit or various kinds of seeds, depending on what kind of bird you're trying to attract. And so having plants that provide these things, either by having fruit like the elderberry in that picture there, or attracting insects to them so that the birds are able to eat them, then those are ways that we can bring birds into our landscape. But they also need shelter. So providing evergreen trees are a great way to provide shelter, especially during the winter. Birds tend to really like open type clearings when they're feeding, and so if they go and they're feeding, they have a nice place where they can go back to a protected spot when they feel threatened. So having evergreen and providing shelter is another way that we can provide benefits for our birds and attract birds to our landscapes. And then finally, the last benefit of native plants that we'll talk about is that they're better adapted to the climate and the soil. So like I said, when talking about ecoregions, we really kind of look at the plant's adaptability to that specific climate and that specific soil conditions. And so planting native plants, they're going to do better because they've been here for years and years and years. We didn't take them from some place or some other ecoregion where maybe they're not so adapted to. So native plants do tend to do a lot better because they're better adapted. And so we kind of say better adapted to the climate, but what are the benefits? How can I convince you that this is worth it? Well, there are less inputs. So because they're adapted to the soil, you don't really have to put down too much fertilizer to make them happy. They might have some insect issues or maybe some disease issues, but they're pretty used to that because they've been here, and we might not have to spray pesticides on them to keep them happy. So we really don't have to put so much energy into them as far as spraying or applying fertilizers. They've been here, they know, they're adapted to fend off those diseases and those insects, and they're adapted to be able to pull up nutrients from that soil much better. They're also lower maintenance because we don't have to be putting these inputs into them. We don't have to be babying them. They are lower maintenance. And then they are better for water conservation, which means that we do not have to irrigate them quite as much. So, if you look at a prairie, there's not sprinkler systems out there in the prairie. And so those plants aren't really used to that additional irrigation beyond what they're given through rainfall. So they're better for water conservation, and they do take less irrigation. And so to visualize this a little bit too, especially in reference to turf grasses, so these are some various native plants. I apologize, I don't have their common names or their scientific names associated with them, but these are some native plants, and they have very deep root systems. And so because they're better adapted to the soil, they're able to put down these very deep root systems and have a very large surface area. So because they have a very large surface area of roots, they're able to pull up more nutrients and they're able to pull up more water. And so they're just more resilient when it comes to withstanding our climate. And to contrast that, turf grasses are all the way over there on the left. We tend to mow them very short, and then they tend to have very short root systems. So not a very wide surface area. They're not able and they're not adapted as well to pull up water and to pull up nutrients, so we have to put more inputs into them, and it ends up just being quite a bit more work as compared to the native plants. So those are some benefits of, oops, pull my headphone out. those are some benefits of native plants. But right now I kind of want to focus on and move on to dispelling some myths. I know that sometimes there's a lot of misconceptions about native plants, and I kind of want to address some of those. So these myths, this is from an article by Penn State Extension called Neighborly Natural Landscaping, and if you are inspired or motivated to convert your landscape to natives, I encourage you to go check out that article. It's a really great one. But they list some myths and then dispel those myths in that article. But I'll share those with you now. So one myth is that meadows and natural landscapes are fire hazards. And so this belief is kind of built around the idea that they're highly flammable. And they're not highly flammable. I mean, if we've had rain and we're not in a drought, then they tend not to be quite so flammable. But if we were to have a fire or anything like that, the native plants and the grasses, they can't sustain heat for more than 20 seconds. And so it's a very quick burn. And for fire to be damaging to your home, it had to burn within 4 feet of the house for 7.5 minutes. And so the native plants, the grasses and everything, can't sustain that high heat for very long. And so if there were to be some kind of fire, it would not be quite so damaging to your home because it can't sustain it for a time period that would be damaging. Another myth is that natural landscapes attract vermin. So things like rats, snakes, nothing that we really want to go see when we go walk outside, especially if you're like me and you walk outside barefoot all the time. Not really something I want to encounter. But some facts about that. Rats are attracted to human-produced food. So they're more likely to go and be in your dumpster than in your native plant garden. So they like oils and fats and things like that. So you're not really going to have rats in your native plant garden. Now snakes, yes, snakes do tend to like kind of brushy, sort of more native type plants where they have a lot of shelter. But snakes are also very good for the ecosystem, and they eat pests like mice, insects, and slugs. Snakes also don't really like to be disturbed a whole lot, and so if you're going to go work in an area, brushing those plants and kind of maybe hitting it with a stick to sort of let them know, hey, I'm going to work in this area, they tend to not really want to go after you necessarily. So those are some, those are some good things about snakes. So don't be too scared of snakes. Natural landscapes are breeding grounds for mosquitoes. Well, mosquitoes need standing water to breed. So things like puddles, maybe a bird bath of stagnant water where it's not moving. So they do require that in order to breed. A turf lawn, a regular turf lawn that we might have, has a very shallow root system. So that image that we saw earlier, and they're less likely to very quickly soak up water because they don't have a very large surface area of their roots. And so if we have a very heavy rain, it takes longer for the lawn to be able to pull up that moisture and be able to prevent those areas of standing water. But those native species are very deep-rooted, and so it's much easier for them to pull that water up real quick, and we don't end up with the standing water that mosquitoes need to breed. And I think this is my last one, but natural landscapes produce pollen that cause suffering for those with allergies. So wind-borne pollens are actually the primary cause of allergies, and so that's kind of what we get in our nose and in our sinuses are wind-borne pollens. And plants with showy flowers, those are usually pollinated by insects. They're not pollinated by wind. So if we're choosing plants that have, those big showy daisy-like flowers, that pollen is not really meant to get in the air and to get into our nose. So culprits that are more likely to cause allergies are ragweed, pigweed, oaks do cause, and then cedars as well. But things like goldenrod or rudbeckia or purple coneflower, they're not meant to be pollinated by wind, and so those don't tend to be causes of allergies for us. So the alternative when it comes to native plants, and this is kind of a worst case scenario situation, but exotic non-native plants, they can become invasive. They can enter our natural wild, untouched landscape. and take over and choke out that native flora. So the picture there I have is kudzu, kudzu growing and choking out the native flora. That's an example of an exotic plant gone horribly wrong. And hopefully we don't have any other situations like this, but of course, bringing new plants in can always have this potential. They can also be a poisonous food source for wildlife. So if we have that wildlife and that group of those specific species of wildlife to our ecosystem, they might not be used to eating those non-native plants. There might be they're not adapted to eating them. That's not a natural food source for them. And if that's their only choice or the majority of their choice, and they go and they try and eat that, it could potentially be toxic to them. And it also requires a lot of environmental manipulation. So we have to kind of trick that plant into being happy. So whether that be through the applications of pesticides or fertilizers or more water or heavily amending that soil, they do tend to require a lot of environmental manipulation to be successful. And so kind of an example that we have in Oklahoma and that we've been dealing with is the Callery pear or the Bradford pear. They have birds will eat the fruit of these trees, and they're starting to really take over some areas, some vacant lots and some undeveloped areas in our area. So that's just kind of to bring it home a little bit. That's an example of one that we're dealing with. But I do want to make a small plug that, not all of them are bad. They're not all bad, but just make sure to do some research. And so this is Russian sage. I'll give you a hint, it's native to Russia, but it's a non-native perennial that performs very well in Oklahoma. So the ecoregion that it's native to is fairly similar to our ecoregion, and so it does perform very well here. But just before making a selection, just do some research and see how it performs and if it has invasive tendency or aggressive tendencies, or is maybe toxic to anyone. So do some research before purchasing, and you should be fine. So those are some benefits. I hope that I have motivated or encouraged you to take a look at native plants. And so we will move on to designing a native plant garden and some hints and tricks for how to make it look very intentional. So first, I encourage you to start with a small area. I don't want anyone to go home and rip out large areas of their lawn today. Just to start small, because major renovations can be very overwhelming. When doing, major renovations, maybe it just becomes maybe more of an expense and more work, and we end up with areas where, we didn't get to that part, and then it becomes an eyesore. So just start with a very, very small area. Kind of pick maybe a corner or a specific bed of your landscape and start there. Say, okay, well, I'm going to maybe try native plants in this spot and expand out season after season. But also, too, many landscapes are inherited. We oftentimes, as gardeners, don't get just a perfectly blank slate to go in and start with. We might have maybe purchased the home and there was an existing landscape there beforehand, or maybe we had a builder who required X, Y, and Z in their planting list, and so we kind of inherit our landscapes. And so build in around the existing area. If you maybe have well-established trees you don't want to get rid of, or shrubs, or maybe there's some plants you really like, but just kind of building in around the existing area can also be a good strategy to start out small and not get overwhelmed. But then also have patience. Like you're kind of talking to a kid, but it's important because, it's not going to all kind of come to fruition in one year, in one season. And so just take things slow, have patience, and we can convert we can kind of add in some things to our native plant garden. With native plant gardens, too, diversity is key. So it's very important to have a wide range of plants within our native plant garden. So you don't want to plant just all one native plant. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is the environmental conditions can vary from year to year. So maybe one year we have maybe uncharacteristic drought conditions, and so because we have those uncharacteristic drought conditions, maybe some of the plants begin to suffer a little bit. But maybe there are some plants, if you have a diverse group, the plants that are more adapted to those uncharacteristic drought conditions will do better. Or maybe we have, May can bring in several inches of rain, and some of that can kind of hinder some of those plants that are more adapted to the drought conditions. But there are some plants that can withstand those wet heats for a sustained period of time. So having this idea of, not putting all your eggs in one basket. So having lots of different plants can help with environmental resilience depending on if we have crazy years or not. But also bloom and fruit seed times vary. So particularly with perennial type plants, they might only bloom for 2 or 3 weeks. And so we don't want all of our plants to bloom for 2 or 3 weeks during one part of the season. So if we're trying to bring in pollinators and protect the wildlife and the ecosystem around us, we don't want to feed those pollinators only 3 weeks of the season. So having varied plants and having lots of different kinds of plants so that we have sustained bloom throughout the season is a good idea in having diversity. I'd also add to this that having diversity in your flower shapes or your flower or your plant family types, certain structures of, I didn't mean to change the slide. Certain structures of flowers tend to be more attractive to certain pollinators. So kind of like the flat daisy type flowers are really good for butterflies. Maybe those tubular type shaped ones are better for bees. But having varied shapes of flowers can also help bring in more and a more diverse group of pollinators. But also be aware of public safety issues. Sometimes native plants can get relatively tall, and if we have those planted right up against the sidewalk, or we have them maybe in an easement or a right-of-way, that can become a public safety issue. So, just because it's a native plant garden doesn't mean it has to look wild. Doing something like this where it's, you've got your lower growing plants in the front and your taller growing plants in the back, kind of stair-stepping it that way can really help it from becoming a public safety issue. Another tip, another tip for designing the garden is to use borders or mow strips. So maybe we're in a neighborhood where we're required to have Bermuda or some other kind of turf grass. That really likes to creep into gardens, and if you've got a nice, dense, lush native garden, it can be very difficult to get your Bermuda out of there. And so having borders or mow strips, maybe of, just like rocks or kind of using like a raised bed type sort of design can really add a neatness and really kind of help. Also makes it easier to mow and to prevent maybe some of your turf grass from getting in there. Now when you're designing too, it's a good idea to use curved lines. Natural areas, they tend to go a little bit better with curves, and it's kind of a little bit more of an informal design style, so using curves kind of sort of helps highlight and just make it look a little bit more natural than if you had maybe a line, straight lines, and boom, boom, boom plants like that. So using curves, kind of designing a more informal style tends to look a little bit better. And then also add some human elements to it. So doing things like paths or benches. As gardeners, we work really hard on our landscapes, and so we want to enjoy them. We want to maybe go have a cup of coffee out there in the morning and enjoy our landscape and listen to the birds. So having benches or tables and chairs where you can go out and actually enjoy your garden is a great way. But also adding in maybe some sundials or some bird baths or just a nice human touch to it. And this kind of gives the perception that the landscape is intentional. So if it was kind of just to be, lots of native plants shoved in there, that maybe to your neighbor who's not as excited about native plants as you are might look a little a little odd, but adding in these little human elements can kind of really give that perception that there's a human touch to this native garden. So like I mentioned this already kind of with the public safety issues too, but some native plants get very tall, so it's a good idea to put these towards the back of the garden. If they get very tall and they start to fall over onto the pathways, you know, it can kind of feel like a jungle, and we don't want those quite so much. So of course put your taller plants towards the back, your more medium, and then your kind of ground covers, low growing plants towards the front. So kind of stair step it in that way. Not only does that kind of help with giving sort of the less impression that it's kind of a wild native jungle, but it also still looks more intentional and looks a little bit more landscaped than if you were to kind of just plant without taking that into consideration. Also, some plants, some plants do reseed, and so if you do have some plants that reseed, put out lots of seeds, give those rooms to spread out. And so that's kind of the nice thing too about those reseeding plants is that you know, you'll always have them again next year. So kind of giving them room and space to spread out can help you in the following year. When it comes to talking a little bit about soil and amendments, unless your soil is really, really bad, fertilizer amendments are generally not recommended. Native plants don't need a whole lot of nitrogen or inputs in order to be successful and to do their thing. A lot of times too, native plants, if they have too many nutrients, will start to flop over, have too much growth, and we don't really want that so much. I will say though, you know, sometimes in new development, they've gone in and they've scraped a lot of the topsoil off, and so that is really difficult to grow plants in any kind of environment, and so you may need some amending if you're in that kind of a situation. But generally, unless it's really bad, it's not needed to put down any fertilizer recommendations. To add, to build the soil, we can use compost or any other kind of organic matter that releases a little bit of nutrients into the soil, but also really just kind of makes the soil, it's better, it holds on to more nutrients when it's got more organic matter, and it drains quite a bit better when it's got more organic matter. So kind of sort of this idea of building soil. With irrigation, we probably need to apply some irrigation at establishment. Really, you know, if you go to the nursery and you buy, you know, plants that have been grown in a gallon pot, they're pretty used to that environment. They're used to getting water, being at a greenhouse. So we kind of have to get them established before they're going to be quite so resilient. So consider that as well. Just because it's a native plant doesn't mean we can stick it out there right out of the nursery pot and it's going to do just fine. But do consider that irrigation will be required at establishment. After that, if the plant's not adapted to wet feet, excess water can be detrimental. So don't overwater once we've established. And if we have drought, you know, we can apply some supplemental irrigation just to kind of sort of bring the water level up back in the soil. But when talking about native plants, you know, they're used to the environment that we have. They're used to the amount of rainfall that we get. And so while they might kind of start to look a little tired and a little worn out, they'll come back next year. But of course, we can always apply some supplemental irrigation if we need to. Also with native gardens, don't fear hungry caterpillars. Just because they're eating on our plants, that's okay. Everything is part of the ecosystem. You know, if your plants aren't being eaten by some kind of insects, they're not part of the ecosystem. So don't fear those hungry caterpillars as they go out to eat some of our plants that we put out. And so also if we do have caterpillars and things eating on our plants, that can provide a food source for birds, and so it's all part of this living system, this ecosystem that we have. So don't freak out if you start to see some of your plants being chewed on. Also be judicial with pesticides. So maybe if you have a vegetable garden and you're, you know, we're treating our vegetable garden differently than the native plant garden that we have, still be judicial with pesticides because, you know, as a pollinator or as an insect, we don't go, okay, this is the native garden, this is where I can eat. oh, this is a vegetable garden, I should be here. You know, that doesn't really go through their brain. They're not able to really kind of see those distinctions that we make. So if you're trying to really promote the ecosystem and the living ecosystem, but you've got a vegetable garden, I encourage you to still be very cautious with your pesticide use. And so especially with broad spectrum pesticides that kill basically every insect, you know, applying those would really be problematic, but also some organic pesticides like the BT products. We would apply those to control caterpillar pests, but if we were to accidentally or inadvertently apply those to our native plant garden, that would impact the caterpillars there too. So just because it's organic, it doesn't necessarily mean it distinguishes between the insects we view as good and the insects we view as bad. And I think this is my last little tidbit, but also respect your neighbors. So just because you want a native landscape doesn't mean your neighbor has to have one. You know, having the ability to, you know, to have a beautiful landscape and to educate your neighbor about why native plants may be more resilient and better for our environment. It doesn't mean that we need to force that upon everybody. You know, just doing our little part is great. You know, with there being more development and more houses kind of in our area, you know, providing those ecosystems within our control goes a long way. But do be respectful of your neighbors. So we've been talking about designing and why you should do it. So now we've gotten to the part where it's what do I plant? What should I put in the ground? And so I kind of always like to bring this up too, but the problem with wildflower packets, and so we see them maybe on, we see them at the nursery centers, or maybe they come with a box of our cereal, and we think, oh, cool, wildflowers. Okay, I'll just go ahead and I can put that out there, and I've got my native plant garden done. Well, I don't want anybody to do that quite so much because, you know, when looking at wildflower packets, I looked at a bunch before this talk, and the #1 plant in those wildflower packets was this plant, the California poppy. I will give you a hint where this is native to, but it's not Oklahoma. And so the California poppy does not do very well in Oklahoma. And so we put those wildflower packets out with the best of intentions, but we don't end up with plants that do well here. And so unless you're buying from a reputable source that is Oklahoma-specific native plants, I would discourage you from just planting wildflower packets because there's no telling what is really in them. It might not be truly native to Oklahoma. It might not do well here, and there's also the potential for something that does too well here and becomes invasive within our environment. So please do be cautious with wildflower packets. Now, to do some research and to maybe check where, what kind of plants do I plant, there are some resources, and I'll share those with you, but the Xerces Society is one. They focus on invertebrate conservation, and so, you know, a lot of our pollinators and our insects and things like that. They have regional specific pollinator-friendly plant lists, and the one that they have for us is the Southern Plains region, and so that kind of covers most of Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Arkansas, and a little bit of Colorado. So that's a place that we can go to find some hyper-local Oklahoma-type native plants. Also, Okies for Monarchs. This is a great organization that really is focused on monarch conservation and helping the monarchs have that successful journey as they migrate. And so this one is specific to monarch butterflies, but it's also specific to Oklahoma. Have resources on what to plant and where you can go buy, so they update their nursery lists. And again, that's specific to Oklahoma, so it's very local. And then I don't have a picture of it here, but when you go to look at their native plant lists, they have it broken up into eastern, western, and central Oklahoma. So again, it's a little bit more tailored to the hyper-local level. The Audubon Society, if you're very passionate about birds and you like to have birds in your landscape, you can go in to the Audubon Society, put in your zip code, and it will give you native plants for birds specific to your zip code. So very, very local that way as well. And so that's just an example of when I put in my zip code. The Missouri Botanical Garden is also a great resource as well. They have a plant database, and so you can go in and you can search for various plants, and it does have that fourth bullet point there will give you the native range. And so they, while not all of their plants in their database are native, they will tell you whether or not it's native to, it'll tell you its native range, and you can check there. And then also the Oklahoma plant database. The tricky one with this is you kind of have to know what you're looking for. So maybe you have a specific plant in mind, but you're not sure if it's native or if it's found specifically in your county. You can go type in that plant name, search, and it'll tell you whether or not it's been found in your county. So, you know, kind of using those larger pollinator lists, you can fine-tune it a little bit more to your microclimate through this resource. But you're attending a native plant webinar, and you're like, well, those are great resources, but I don't want to have to go do all the work. You should tell me. So these are my next slides. Okay, but what do I plant? And so we will start with, we will go over annuals, perennials, ornamental grasses, and then I've included a couple trees and shrubs that are better adapted, to our landscape. So starting with annuals, annual is a plant that we do have to plant every year, so it completes its life cycle in 1 year. Some benefits about annuals is that they can provide consistent color throughout the year. So having annuals in the landscape, you know, kind of sort of provides some consistency throughout the year. They tend to be very easy to grow, and so kind of a great thing to do for beginners. But they do reseed. So native type annuals are very prolific, and so while they may complete their life cycle in 1 year, as an annual, they may be perennially present in your garden by reseeding. And that's also sort of something to consider, kind of a cautionary note when planting annual types, is that, you know, if they do reseed and you don't want quite so much of that particular plant, you may have to go in and do a little bit of cleanup at the beginning of the season. But some annuals to check out. Snow on the Mountain. This is kind of, it gets sort of almost shrubby-like in appearance. And the flowers are insignificant, but it is particularly selected and grown for its foliage. So it has those nice white bands on its leaves. It is a euphorbia, so it's closely related to the poinsettia. So, you know, kind of looking at, you can kind of tell that sort of by looking at those flowers. And it does have a milky fat, so almost like poinsettia as well. It does have that milky fat that can be irritating, and so it does tend to be poisonous to livestock, or maybe some pets that want to chew on it. So just do be aware of that if you want to plant this one. Sneezeweed, it is a very prolific reseeder, but it does have those cute little button daisy-like flowers, and can add some nice yellow color to the landscape. It does prefer full sun, but can tolerate some shade in the garden. But I've seen this one in a few gardens, and it does reseed. So just as a cautionary note, it will be perennially present in your garden. Sunflowers as well. There are many varieties and different subspecies of sunflowers, many different colors. These are great for birds as those seed heads develop and mature and they have seeds. They can be a great food source for the local birds. They too tend to get fairly tall, so this is a great one to kind of have at a backdrop or maybe along a fence line. Not maybe one so much to plant really close up to the front of your garden. And passion flower is a strikingly beautiful flower, very unique and kind of exotic looking. There are a lot of different varieties. The kind of common type is that purple one there seen in the picture, but there's also maroon, pink, and white types. A lot of different varieties that are very beautiful. It does have a vining habit, and so It can be kind of a little bit weedy in a way, but if you give it a trellis and you give it kind of some support, it can be a very a beautiful centerpiece or maybe a focal point in your garden. Like I mentioned earlier, it is the host plant for Gulf fritillaries. I have a hard time saying that word, fritillary, and but they do feed on it, and so while it can be a little bit weedy and can be a little bit of an aggressive grower, the caterpillar should keep it in check. And if you are growing the common type, they do have an actual edible fruit, the passion fruit, and so that can be kind of fun too if you're looking to add some edible aspects to your landscape. So now we'll move on to perennials. I've got a lot more perennials available, or a lot more perennials in this presentation, because it tends to be when planting native plants, what people prefer, because they kind of sort of tend to stay a little bit more in one spot and aren't so quite reseeding all over the place. But perennials, the benefit with them is that they come back every year. So they complete their life cycle through multiple years, and so they'll go dormant in the fall, kind of with that first freeze, and reemerge in the springtime. The downside to perennials is that they do tend to have a short bloom time, so maybe only 2 or 3 weeks, depending on what you're planting. We may have to cut them back or deadhead them to kind of sort of encourage them to bloom a little bit more, but they don't so much. They do tend to have a shorter bloom period than the annuals. But kind of sort of the flip side or the silver lining of that is that there's a transition of color throughout the season. So, you might have more yellow type plants early in the spring and maybe more purple plants in the summertime, and then move on to maybe red and blues in the fall. And so you can kind of have this variation throughout the year, and so it's always something changing, always something to look forward to, and can kind of be a very fun part about perennial type plants. They're also movable, so you can, if you put it somewhere and it's not too happy, it is a little bit better adapted to being dug up and placed somewhere else. Annuals, you do that, it really kind of shocks them. They don't have time to recover. And so perennials you can kind of sort of play with a little bit till you get it just right and just the way you like it. So we'll go over some perennials now. Starting with yarrow. Yarrow has very ferny-like foliage with these nice sort of, I think it's in like islands of yellow or various colors of flowers. They come in a lot of different colors, yellow, white, purple, pink. There's all sorts of varieties. I have talked to a couple people who have mentioned and tried a lot of the varieties that really it's the yellow and the white ones. Those are the more native types, and so they're going to be a little bit more resilient. But this is going to be a plant for a full sun area. Arkansas Blue Star. Arkansas Blue Star during the beginning of the season, kind of where it gets its name, has these nice light pale blue star-shaped flowers, and those tend to fade towards the end of the season, but then the beautiful striking yellow orangey fall foliage provides some interest in the fall. So kind of a double one with this one where we get the flowers and the fall foliage. It has a really nice sort of needle, wispy-like foliage, kind of sort of moves in the breeze really nicely, can kind of add some movement to your garden. It does prefer full sun, but can tolerate a little bit of shade as well. Eastern Red Columbine, this is a great one for a shady area. So if you have kind of a dry shade spot, this plant will do very well. It has these nice whirling ballerina type flowers that tend to be red where they face down, and the plant structure itself kind of tends to lead towards more of like a cottage or a wildflower type garden if that's kind of the look you're going for, and so a great one for a shady native garden. Blue False Indigo, this one has these purple spikes of pea-like flowers. It has a very upright habit, and so kind of a good medium type plant to sort of put behind some ground covers in your garden. It does bloom earlier in the summer, but as it blooms and after it blooms, it will produce some seed pods, and those seed pods provide some nice form and some nice texture throughout the following season. This one is actually a legume, and so it will fix nitrogen in the soil and will add a little bit of nitrogen back to your soil. So kind of a good one too to sort of help build soil. Wine cup is it's kind of a mat forming type plant. It's an excellent ground cover with these very deep cup-shaped flowers, kind of where it gets the name. But it's, like I mentioned, it's a great ground cover. It doesn't get too tall and can be a great one to use in the front portions of your garden. Coreopsis, a very popular plant for native and wildflower gardens. It's an early summer bloomer, but it kind of sort of continues to bloom if you deadhead it and kind of cut it back. There are a lot of different varieties. A lot of them you'll see mostly yellow, but with some shades of red or brown within the center of that flower. And so kind of a lot of options there. It does tend to reseed prolifically, kind of like an annual. And so just a cautionary note with that one, but a good one that will kind of maybe fill in some of those spots, those empty spots for you. A great bee and butterfly plant. And this one too really needs well-drained soil. It doesn't like wet feet. So if you have it more of in like a low spot, it's probably not going to do very well. But full sun, well-drained should do great. Carolina larkspur has these very slender, kind of smaller, upright little flowers that are really attractive to bees and to some of the smaller pollinators. Kind of a white to pale blue flower. This one is an earlier bloomer, so great for the bees as they start to come out early, and then also for your hummingbirds. So hummingbirds tend to like trumpet or tube-shaped flowers. So any plant that you provide that kind of has sort of that flower structure to it is really great for hummingbirds. Bundle flower, this one's kind of a unique one. It's got these sort of interesting looking brown seed pods that kind of sort of have a very unique form to them. Kind of almost look like a flower in a way. But they've also got a mimosa, very ferny-like foliage, so a very unique kind of interesting plant. Easiest to grow this one from seed. So if you've got a friend who has some bundle flower, go say, hey, can I borrow some of this? And plant it out that way. It does kind of get tall and sort of start to flop over a little bit, especially if it's in highly amended, happy soil. And so just be, you might want to kind of maybe give it some sort of a nice human touch to prevent that weedy structure. But just a note there. Purple coneflower, again, a very, very popular plant, maybe kind of what we tend to think of when we think of native plants. The first one that our mind goes to, but the classic native type has that orange sort of center, kind of a rough center with the purple rays, with purple petals along the edge. It does have a very dark, rough foliage, and so deer and other things like that are less likely to go chew on it because it does have that rough, very textured foliage. A very happy, a very prominent pollinator plant as well. And there are many varieties as this one. So I mentioned that purple one, but there are oranges and oranges and reds and whites that do pretty well. The most resilient is kind of the more native type with the purple flowers, but it's always fun to try and add in some other varieties. Rattlesnake Master, this was, I believe, chosen as the Oklahoma Proven Perennial of 2020, I think. So last year, that's where they select a very resilient, very adapted annual perennial shrub and tree every year. And so I think this was 2020 selection for a perennial. And it's a very unique plant. It sort of resembles like a yucca as it begins to grow, and it sends up these unique-looking ball-shaped flowers, and these ball-shaped flowers are very attractive to all kinds of insects. And so if you're looking to bring in some beneficials or maybe some other types of insects to your landscape to kind of really boost the ecosystem in that spot, this is a great one for that. But it also provides winter interest, and so if you don't cut it back and you let it kind of sort of dry out at the end of the season, It will maintain that height and that form, and kind of sort of gives you something to look at as maybe a lot of the other plants begin to go dormant and beneath the soil. So kind of sort of provides the eye something to look at. Blanket flower, this is our state wildflower, so a very popular one as well. Many different varieties. The classic type tends to have a more red center with those yellow tips. It is very drought tolerant, so much so that it really does not do well with a lot of water. So if, again, a low spot or even a year where we have a lot of rain and it kind of sits in that water, it's not going to like that so much. So it tends to really like that well-drained soil. And of course, a great butterfly plant as well. Prairie blazing star, I really like this one. It has these very tall spikes of purple flowers with a very needle-like foliage. It's very upright, and so kind of a good one to sort of maybe put towards the back and kind of fill in with other plants around it. It does require full sun and well-drained soils. This is one that if you take too good of care of it, it will fall over. And so if it's overwatered or over-fertilized, it's going to grow up so much that it starts to flop over. And so do be careful with that because, when we're going after a native landscape where it's low maintenance, we don't want to have to stake up our perennials. So just a note on that one, that don't baby it too much. Spotted bee balm, I believe Okies for Monarchs lists this as one of their top 10 plants for monarchs within the state, but kind of has these nice, interesting pale pink flowers. It is very upright, and so kind of very spiky in a way, so kind of an interesting form to it that way. It does spread by runners, but tends not to be too aggressive if in an area where it's not getting too much love. Evening primrose, this is one that kind of tend to open in the evening with these sort of yellow flowers, pale yellow flowers. Bees really do like evening primrose, and moths as well, which they're nocturnal, so they kind of like those evening type flowers that open around dusk. There are a couple different forms or varieties that you can get, maybe one with more of an upright, and then also one with more of a trailing, so kind of can serve different roles in the landscape. Prickly pear, if you like cactus, this is really your best option in Oklahoma. A lot of the cactus that are more native to the west, we get a little bit too much rain for them, and so prickly pear is better adapted to the amount of rain that we get. It's a cactus, so some of the varieties are going to have spines, and so just consider that. If you've got little people or dogs or anyone who runs out into your landscape, this would probably not be the one to have, especially right outside your back door or anything like that. There are some spineless varieties available, so that's also another option, but if you do get a spiny type, be very, very careful and strategic on where you plant it, because it can also get very large. So it can get very large and it can take over an area, and when it's spiky, it's not a whole lot of fun to get in there and try and pull sort of any weeds or unnecessary plants in that spot. So do be careful and strategic on where you put this one, especially if you grow the spiny type. Mexican hat, another one, another native that kind of has that sort of daisy-like flower. This is another one that's very easy to start from seeds, probably easier to start from seeds, so look for a seed packet rather than maybe a plant within the garden center. It's a summer bloomer, likes full sun, also very drought tolerant, and kind of has that nice wild look to it. So if that's kind of sort of really what you're going for, this is a good addition. Blue azure sage, this one has those tubular type shaped flowers, and so I think that means to say April to July is when they appear, not July to April, but the blue flowers will appear kind of tend to earlier in the spring. It does tend to get very tall and a little bit gangly, so it would be one to maybe cut back about midway through the season to really promote more growth and to kind of keep it compact and a little less wild looking, because it can get relatively tall. Compass plant, this is another one that can get very, very tall. I've seen it get to about 8 to 9 feet tall, so definitely one for the back of the garden, maybe along the fence line, but a great one for butterflies and bees as well. And so very, very prolific bloomer, and so those insects will go after it. And it's called compass plant. I think this is interesting, but because the leaves tend to orient north to south, and so because they orient that way, it got the nickname compass plant. Goldenrod. Goldenrod has these a very prolific bloomer with small little yellow flowers to kind of create these plumes. And this one is a very late bloomer. So it blooms more towards the fall, more during the later season, and so it's a very important food source for the insects before they go into hibernation. And so selecting, having diverse plants and plants that bloom at diverse times, that's very important, and there's less food sources the closer we get to winter, and so this is one that can provide that nice little boost before we reach the hibernation period. This one is often confused for ragweed. I think I saw an allergy commercial the other day that had a picture of goldenrod in the background, and I was so mad because this is not ragweed. This does not cause allergies. And so if that's a concern to you, please don't be scared of this plant. Aromatic aster, this one has sort of very spiny almost looking purple flowers you can see there in the picture. It does tolerate a little bit of shade but can prefer full sun, and is a great host plant for many moths but other insects as well. And so kind of those nice sprays of flowers are very easy for the insects to walk on, and so we end up with them being able to come and feast upon that nice pollen buffet, if you will. Black-eyed Susan, another very popular daisy-like wildflower kind of plant, typically yellow with a brown center. It can be relatively short-lived. I've heard these referred to as short-lived perennials, so they might only last 2 or 3 years, but it will reseed. So if you plant the more native types, so planting those, reseeding those types can help it stay and exist in the landscape for longer. This would be another one to deadhead, to make sure to go in and cut the flowers that have been spent and are kind of sort of starting to fade, to promote it to bloom throughout the season. So you can extend the bloom season if you go in and deadhead the spent flowers. Giant coneflower, a very close relative of coneflower, except giant. It gets very large, up to 5 to 6 feet tall. Has a kind of more of a grayish-green color to the foliage, so that's kind of unique. You can kind of see in that picture there as compared to the plants surrounding it. The foliage adds sort of a unique color and some interest as well. If we do go through a kind of unseasonably droughty period, it can start to decline, so you may choose to supply some supplemental irrigation to this one, but tends to kind of come back as we get those rains. And also is a great one for pollinators as well. American germander, this is a clump-forming member of the mint family, so it tends to kind of spread and fill out an area. Has these very showy white purple flowers, kind of almost look like a slipper, but kind of that tubular shape that's great for those bees and those hummingbirds. It does tolerate some poorly drained soil, so don't have to amend it quite so much or be so selective about where you put it. It can kind of handle those more low spots and can also tolerate some shade. So it's a good one for those kinds of locations. Blue jacket is a clump forming. It's also called Tradescantia. It gets about 3 feet tall and has these very kind of unique, almost whorled type flower clusters. I think it kind of looks unique and adds a very interesting form and texture to the garden. And it also has blue flowers, and so blue flowers aren't quite as common. We don't get to play with that color palette too often in the garden, but this is one where you can bring some blue in. You might also hear this referred to as spiderwort. That's another common name for it. Verbena, a very popular plant that we've been planting in the garden for a long time, is actually native to our area. Has clusters of small white small flowers. There are 2 perennial varieties that are pretty easy to find in the nursery centers. I believe it's called Homestead Purple and Homestead Red. So those are 2 great perennial options. It is a ground cover, so one to sort of put towards the front of your garden to kind of fill out some space. There are other colors available of verbena, but those tend to be more annual types, not quite as resilient as some of those more native types. It does tend to decline if it's being overwatered or if we're very humid, and so just kind of sort of be aware of that if you want to go with this plant. That brings me to the conclusion of our perennials. By all means, that's not an exhaustive list, but going through those resources that I mentioned earlier, those are some that are local to our area and also great for birds and butterflies and bees and particularly drought tolerant. So like I said, by all means, not an exhaustive list. There are a lot of great native perennials, but some that you might be interested in. So now we're going to move on to ornamental grasses. Most of these are perennial, and they're very adapted to drought-tolerant conditions. So they have nice, deep root systems that make them just more resilient to the weather conditions that we have. A great thing, too, about ornamental grasses is that they provide some winter interest. So as we have a freeze, it will maintain its structure, maintain its form, and kind of add some interest in the garden. Also nice, as we get winds, can kind of add that rustling noise, sort of add some kind of a nice element to the garden. These are also very easy to divide and replant. So if you have one, you grow it for a couple seasons, you can divide it, plant it back out, give it to your friends, and so kind of something you can do with your ornamental grasses. And thinking too, about us, we're kind of sort of on the cusp of the cross timbers and the Great Prairie or the Great Plains. Grasses are a very important part of our ecosystem, and so that's why I give them their own category, is because we should really try to incorporate some ornamental grasses into our landscape. So starting with big bluestem, gets its name from kind of the bluish, reddish, purplish appearance that it has. Really kind of a nice, unique foliage color. It's relatively tall, so it's great for kind of a background. So if you have it as a background, plant flowers in front of that, that can be very, very nice. And this one does need to be cut back in the spring for new growth. And big bluestem is a very important native prairie plant, and so kind of really does play an important role in the ecosystem. Purple threon, this one has kind of a unique looking seed head with these sort of purplish brilliant branches, so when the light catches it just right, it's real almost purpley iridescent type color. It tends to stay a bit smaller, and so maybe kind of a better one for edging or a border. It does have a very deep root system, which makes it good for erosion control. So if you have a slope, it's something that you can place on there to really help with runoff or anything like that. And then the seeds are attractive to birds. And so that's true for a lot of these ornamental grasses, is that the birds will really go after a lot of those seed heads, especially in the wintertime. Side oats grama gets to about 2.5 feet tall, kind of has a very spiky type flower structure with an oat-like seed, kind of sort of starts to hang from them, almost looks like fish on a pole or so, if you'd say, with bluish-gray leaf leaves. Usually found growing with little bluestem, another prairie plant, prairie grass. But it does not compete very well with the taller ornamental grasses. So, with something that gets relatively tall, it probably needs to be standalone, kind of maybe more as a focal point than sort of intermixed with other grasses. Blue grama, I've also heard this one called mosquito grass, and you can kind of understand why. It sort of almost looks like a swarm of mosquitoes, but like in a good way, not in a bad way. And really when the wind catches it, it really moves and has a lot of movement to it. But it has these tufted chartreuse seed heads, sort of kind of give some contrast to the foliage, which is bluish gray most of the year, but turns golden brown in the fall. Northern sea oats. This is going to be one of our more shade-tolerant ornamental grasses, so if you have a shady area, it's a good option. Do be cautious with this one because it is an aggressive reseeder, and so those little seed heads, they're very interesting, and they add a lot of interest and texture to the garden, but if you're concerned about them spreading, it's a good idea to remove those before it starts releasing those into your landscape, because it can really take over. Love grass, this one has a very fine foliage, almost sort of looks like a misty type spray. Very whimsical, kind of catches the wind really nicely since it's so misty. This is another one that has a very dense root system and is good for erosion control, but does require full sun. Switchgrass, there are many varieties of switchgrass coming out, really kind of a lot of work going into different colors and different textures and different forms, and it's also a very important grass for our ecosystem, so definitely one to check out. I also kind of think it has more of a modern form to it, and so maybe if you are going for more of a formal type garden, maybe a little bit more modern, this would be one that would look very nice kind of in rows, sort of planted as a screen. I have that in the slide actually, that planted as a screen, because it'll fill in nicely and kind of maintain that very basal type form. Little blue stem, very bluish gray, upright, but does develop a nice red tan color in the fall. It works great as a background plant, or you can plant lots of them together to create sort of a mass planting, kind of like that bottom picture in the slide. And then the white seed tufts, they will begin to appear in the fall and kind of add some interest. Indian grass, this is another one that is very important to our local ecosystem. That tends to be a little bit taller with these golden brown plumes. There are a lot of varieties available, so depending on kind of the color of foliage that you're going for, you can really sort of select and decide based on that. With deep orange to purple fall color, so always great to get some fall interest. And this one does need to be cut back. So these more kind of tall type grasses would do very well if you cut them back at the early spring. Okay, moving on to trees and shrubs. I will say the list of trees and shrubs I do have is not an exhaustive list. There are lots available, so I just wanted to highlight a couple for you today. But trees and shrubs are a very important component of our landscape. They really sort of add some structure and some anchor because they will, in the wintertime, they maintain their woody appearance and provide that really kind of height and sort of permanence to the garden. Some are flowering, and then some also are evergreen, which provide winter interest. They can be very important for providing screens, and so if you don't like your neighbor too much, planting trees and shrubs along the side of that property line is a great way to screen yourself off from that neighbor. And then also a very important role of trees and shrubs is providing habitat for birds. And so birds, they like to, they'll start to feed, but they like to have somewhere they can go back very quickly if they feel threatened. And so having sort of a mass planting of trees and shrubs a few feet away from where you maybe have a bird feeder or a lot of plants that provide food for that bird, that gives them a little bit of a safety net, so if they feel threatened, can quickly go back to a protected spot. So just a couple trees and shrubs that I want to highlight. So starting with Caddo sugar maple, has a very dense rounded crown, a great tree for a statement in the front of your lawn, kind of as a shade tree, and then does have a good fall foliage. This one is very susceptible to root rot and other issues with soggy soils. So if you have, I would not recommend this one if you have an irrigation system or maybe in a low spot where you get a lot of moisture. This one is really needs to be very heavily well-drained soil. American beautyberry, this is more of a shrub. It's kind of more of an understory plant. but it has these very attractive purple fruit that appear in fall, and those will persist through early winter. So great for birds to go eat that fruit, and then kind of nice to add some color in the late fall. So, you know, that's sort of a time where the garden feels like it's shutting down, so to have a nice pop of color is very refreshing, especially this time of year. I mentioned it's kind of an understory plant, so it does like full sun, but can really tolerate filtered shade. So maybe if you've got it underneath a tree or maybe on the side of a house where it gets some shade, it'll do just fine. There are also white cultivars available, so if purple's not your color and you more prefer white, those cultivars are available as well. Hackberry, I know there's a lot of negative perception about hackberry, but if you sort of treat it like a tree, train it to really kind of sort of look to be sort of that nice standard shape of a tree, it can actually be a lovely shade tree. It does have a very interesting bark that develops kind of a corky ridge, warty texture, and so that can kind of be interesting to catch your eye and to look at that. And it does have these little berry-like droops, and those are very attractive to birds, and so a great tree if you're looking to bring in some birds. Redbud, this is our state tree, a very good drought-tolerant plant. Does tend to stay a bit smaller than a lot of those other big shade tree types, so if you have a very small lawn and you need to have a tree, this is a great option. And then kind of just a fun fact, I like to point this out, but it does bloom on old wood, and so that's really why it's such a prolific bloomer, and we get so much purple, but you also might see the occasional bloom on the trunk. So that's what my bottom picture is there. Desert willow. Desert willow has very needle-like foliage with these pinkish type flowers. I've seen this one kind of planted a lot maybe underneath power lines because it does tend to stay pretty small. Don't have to go in there and trim back that tree quite as much. But again, this is another one where if you're in maybe a low spot or your soil just tends to stay pretty soggy, it would not do very well in that spot. Roughleaf dogwood. This is a thicket-forming shrub, grows to about 6 to 15 feet tall. Can be a little bit aggressive, but if you prune it, kind of stay on top of it, it will do pretty well. But it has these nice sort of clusters of white flowers from May to June, so kind of a source for bees and pollinators. And then it does form kind of a fruit later in the season, which can provide food for birds. Carolina buckthorn, another sort of smallish type tree that grows to about 10 to 15 feet, has very shiny, bright green leaves, kind of almost looks like a holly, but those red fruit will turn black as the weather cools, and so kind of has that nice red during the summertime, but the flowers aren't really the show here, it's the fruit. Deciduous holly, also sometimes referred to as possum haw. This is a native holly that we have to our area, so provides those nice red berries, but kind of the unique one about this one too is that it actually drops its leaves, so it's not evergreen, but it holds on to the fruit, and so you end up with this nice spray of red berried branches in the wintertime. And can provide not only food for wildlife, but also interest and color to your garden in the winter. Osage orange, this is kind of a more medium deciduous tree. These were kind of historically planted a lot of times on homesteads as windbreaks, and so you might see them out in fields or something like that. But a lot of times we recognize them often more so for their fruit, which are these very large we sometimes call hedge apples. But this fruit can be messy, I will say, but there are Osage orange is dioecious, which is to mean that there are male and female varieties. So if you get the male form of the Osage orange, you won't have to deal with the fruit. Mulberry, another one that can kind of be a little bit messy with some fruit. I will say I lived in a house that had a mulberry tree over the driveway. That was a little bit rough on my white car, but it's all good. But they do have these blackberry-like fruits that taste actually pretty much like blackberries. but not only can we eat them, but the birds like them as well. So maybe not one to plant over a sidewalk or a road or your driveway, but if you have sort of an area maybe in the backyard where you can devote some area to this tree, that would be a great spot. This one's also dioecious, so if you get the male form, you don't have to deal with the fruit. Oaks, there are several species of oaks that are native to Oklahoma. I didn't put each individual species in here, but they are very important to our forests and our native wooded type areas. They're a host to a lot of insect species, and so also providing food and some shelter to birds. So oaks are a very common, but for a good reason, plant in our area. Mexican plums, they are tend to be a smaller tree, but they bloom profusely very early in the season with a white flower. So I tend to recommend this one if you're looking to get rid of your Bradford pears, but are still looking for a nice springtime white flower. This is a great one to add in as well, and it's great for early season pollinators who are looking for a food source. Fragrant sumac, this one is a dense-flowing, low-growing shrub. It can be a little aggressive because it spreads by suckers, and so maybe just don't take too good care of it. But some positives about this plant is that it does have a very beautiful red fall foliage, and so that can provide some good interest. And the male flowers too, you can see them in that picture in the bottom. They kind of add some uniqueness to it with the female flowers later in the season producing berries, which are attractive to wildlife. Another sumac, staghorn sumac, has kind of a unique form to it. Kind of grows up and then sticks out with those downward-facing leaves. I kind of find that very interesting. And then the flower clusters provide some interest as well. And then those flower clusters are filled with seeds, which are great for birds, and it does have that nice reddish fall foliage. Okay, so that brings me to the end of the trees and shrubs that I wanted to highlight today. And I just kind of want to, we're getting to the end of the talk, and I just kind of wanted to wrap up with some take-home points. And so native plants, they have many benefits. There are many benefits to having native plants. You don't have to necessarily go total native, but just including some native plants in your landscape can go a very long way. And that's because they provide a habitat for pollinators. Many pollinators are in decline, and this having native plants can help. Also provides food for wildlife, so birds and things like that can be a great food source for them. And they're also better adapted for our environment. And so not only does that mean that they're less work, it also means that it takes less input. And if you have less inputs, that's less money that you have to put into your landscape. When you go to plant your native landscape, consider the ecosystem, consider the microclimate, consider what conditions your landscape has, and keep that in mind as you design your native plant garden. And there are many native plants. Like I said, there are lots of great native plants. Check out those resources I provided. What I talked about today was by all means not an exhaustive list, so continually check out because there are many different colors, forms, textures to really provide a unique and interesting landscape. So I put this in here. If you are in central Oklahoma, these are two local native plant nurseries that I'm aware of. Our Prairie Wind and Wild Things nurseries, so they tend to focus on native plants and maybe do some programming as well to promote native plants. If you are aware of any others, or maybe you're in another part of the state and you want to give a shout out to your local native plant nursery, please do that. Put that in the chat to share with others. But I just wanted to share these two because they're two I'm aware of. And then a quick shameless plug for a couple of OSU resources. Please check out our fact sheet website. It's recently been revamped, and so you can go in there, search for whatever topic you're interested in. So maybe if you're more interested, say, like in fall gardening or soil amendments, go in there and it'll pull up all of our fact sheets and resources related to that topic. So go check that out. There's a lot a lot to check out in that database. And then I would love if you would follow my program on social media. So we have a Facebook page for Cleveland County Horticulture, and then also an Instagram as well. So we post on our Facebook page our garden tips, maybe if something's coming a lot in the office, maybe we've seen a lot of spider mites come in, we'll post that and say, hey, we're seeing a lot of this, be on the lookout. And then we'll also post some of the webinars. Well, we've been having webinars for the past 6 months or so, but just some of the events that we're having. But if you're not in Cleveland County, you're still welcome to follow me, but also check out, check and see if your local county extension office has social media pages, because they'll be posting events that are particularly local to you. I definitely know Oklahoma County has a very active social media presence, so check them out as well. Thank you, and I will take any questions that you have. I appreciate you all joining me this morning. It's almost lunchtime, right?
I've had a couple of questions come in. Let's see, the first question is, what are some of your favorite natives for shade? Yeah.
For shade, definitely that red columbine plant that we talked about, eastern red columbine, that does well, and is probably one of my favorites. Blanking right now, but there are a lot out there. I think I probably I tend to focus maybe on the sun types today, because the sun types are going to be more adapted to dry and water conservation conditions. So I apologize. I should definitely add more shade plants to this talk.
Quite often, and probably one of the most popular workshops that we posted is, shade plants. Especially for water conservation, because people we like trees, but we also want to be able to enjoy native plants, I think, underneath the shade of that canopy. Brian also mentions that blue mist flower is a great choice for shade. Let's see, another question from Pat is, when should we plant columbine seeds?
Columbine seeds. I apologize. I personally haven't planted it from seed. I know that if you're purchasing it from a landscape, it would probably be better adapted to a spring type planting. But of course, planting in fall too kind of gives it time to get adapted to the surrounding landscape. So I'd have to do a little bit of research on that one. I'm sorry, Pat. Right, I did. Toad lilies are great. I forgot about toad lilies.
Amy wanted to let you know that she really enjoyed the workshop, and thanks for taking the time and putting it all together and putting it out there.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you. I enjoyed having you guys here.
If you guys do have any questions, please. Oh, we've got one. This is a great question, and I think both you and I could probably answer it. Do you think there are any educational programs that are making positive impacts for helping homeowners or even developers choose or replace with native to help build our environment? She loves having a large plant list. And I can tell you, Kayla, that, with the city of Oklahoma City, we have our water conservation programs. We work with both homeowner associations and neighborhoods, along with individual residents, to help kind of that built environment. And we also have a plant database on our website, so you can just go to squeezeeverydrop.com and go to our plant database, and you can search it through there. Most of those plants are water smart plants. Not all of them are native, but most of them are native and or adapted to Oklahoma and would help make a water smart landscape more efficient. But Courtney, what's your answer to that?
I hope so. I hope the programming is helping. I know we've had some conversations with homeowners and particularly sometimes in neighborhoods where a lot of the topsoil has been scraped off, and you're really dealing with very poor soil. And so a lot of times in those neighborhoods, really try to encourage native plants. You know, the first year they're going to be kind of rough, but those native plants are really going to help build that soil back up. And so that's something I see a lot of times where we have those conversations of, you know, I just bought this house, I built this house, I don't think I have any soil in my yard. And so we start having conversations about native plants to try and help build that soil back up.
I know I live in a newer build addition, and, you know, dealing with that compacted red clay has been a real pain in the rear. And so trying to even get a lawn that is happy and healthy for our pets. And Kayla agrees with what is being said, and I think that, you know, we just have to make those small incremental changes. I like there's one of the guys from the Oklahoma County a conservation district, you know, always asks the question, what is the one thing you can do to improve your soil, to improve that lived environment? And I think if we just kind of live with that mentality of, you know, what's one thing I can do this season to make that change? Is it planting pollinators? Is it adding organic matter to my landscape? What is that one thing? And then eventually, in 5 years, all of those one things have really added up to make a huge impact. Pat asked, do you think it's safe to get compost from the Norman compost facility now?
I recommend with the City of Norman compost, absolutely get it. I'm so happy we have that resource to our residents, to the City of Norman residents. But I tend to don't plant into it right away. It kind of needs a little bit of time. There's the nitrogen within that compost isn't quite totally finished. And so sometimes just applying it straight to plants can be a little shocking, but absolutely get it, hold on to it, kind of finish it off a little bit in your composting facility, and then begin slowly adding it in. And so I know with a citywide compost, we don't really have any control over what goes into that, and so I kind of always recommend, you know, if it's a concern to you, just kind of sort of start adding it in slowly.
Recommends going to the website okcompostconference.org. That is currently going on through the month of October, and there are weekly presentations happening around the compost conversations. And they have a lot of resources on that website. Again, that was okcompostconference.org. And I believe their next presentation is tomorrow, I think. So, yeah, if you're interested in that compost, Courtney, when you're saying to Pat that she needs to help finish it whenever she brings it home, what would that entail? What would that entail for someone that is not a big compost?
Not a big composter. I would designate a spot to for in your yard and essentially have the pile or what you bring home. Maybe if you're keeping it in trash bins or something like that, just kind of give it a few more weeks to really kind of cook and break down, and then that way it sort of has the finishing process, can kind of sort of continue cooking, if you will. Because I know I've talked to some people who have used that the Norman City compost and have said it's maybe about 90% finished from the composting perspective, but if you give it just a little bit more time and kind of slowly check on it by sort of experimenting with it, then that's kind of what I mean, is just sort of giving it a little bit more of a composting time. Because that will help break down if there's any herbicide residue or weed seeds or anything like that, kind of sort of finish it while you're monitoring it.
Well, I really appreciate your time, Courtney, and it looks like we haven't had any other questions come in, but I will be sending all of this out to our attendees that had signed up to RSVP for the workshop, so hopefully they can get a hold of you with that. I'll send your contact slide out there too, so they can circle back with us and let us know.
Yeah, absolutely.
Perfect.
That sounds great. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Christina, for having me. It was a pleasure. Sounds good.